Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session of Feather Live. Today, we have an amazing conversation with two experts in the industry, and we're going to be talking all about 2024 marketing plans and how you can really shape that in a way that drives growth for your nonprofit organization. Many of you have already been chiming in on your number one priority. And I did want to call out, I did love that someone said, can I say both? And I think this is a challenge. And we're going to talk about this as we think through our 2024 plans and chat with our experts today. But you ultimately, a priority is a one priority. And so if you said both, just put one that you believe is the most important to you and your organization this year that you have to get right. And whether that's acquisition or retention, definitely drop that in the chat. We're going to be talking about this dilemma that we always navigate throughout the conversation today. For those that don't know, the reason we host these types of Feather Live sessions is because Feather is the nonprofit marketing platform purpose-built for you. And as part of not only being a software company, we also want to make sure that we're facilitating conversations about what good marketing looks like at nonprofits, whether you're an association or a charity or an arts and culture organization. And that's why we do these sessions nearly every week. We come to you live, either with an educational session, product conversation, or in today's case, a panel conversation where we're going to bring experts together or operators to talk about a key subject. But really, this is only possible because of the work that we do alongside over 1,500 nonprofits that use the Feather platform. And again, a lot of these conversations and inquiries and why we curate the types of speakers we do is because we get to listen and learn from all of these customers every single day here at Feather and know what's top of mind for these organizations and how we can better serve through content and community alongside of you. So we are going to dive into today's session on how to build a high growth marketing plan for 2024. I'm going to get rid of these slides because we don't need those anymore. And I'm going to invite our two expert panelists up to join me today. First and foremost, we have Dan Reed, who's the VP of Fundraising at Media Cause. Hey, Dan.
Hi, Noah. Hi, everyone. Good to be here today.
Absolutely. Glad you're here, Dan. And our second panelist is Josh Alcorn. He's the co-producer of the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference and also the president at JMA Strategies and all around a fundraising problem solver. Josh, welcome.
Great to be here, Noah. Great to meet you today, Dan. Excited to talk with everybody.
Absolutely. Well, if at any point in today's session you have questions for our panel, just drop it into the chat. We'd love to make sure we address as many of your questions as possible. But to kick us off, before we really get into it, I'd love if each of you could share how you got into working alongside nonprofits and what was that kind of squiggle that got you to the work that you're doing today. Dan, kick us off today.
Sure. I've been doing digital online fundraising since 2006. So I started off at a men's health nonprofit in Chicago, which is where I'm from. And then after that, spent quite a bit of time at the Smithsonian Institution here in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm at now. And then after the Smithsonian, I headed up World Food Program USA's digital fundraising efforts. That's a Friends of the UN agency. And since then, I've been at Media Cause, which is where I'm dialing in from today for the last 5 years. And have since been able to work with like lots and lots and lots of nonprofits. So really looking forward to talking about some of the challenges around acquisition, retention, and I love talking about how unique they might manifest to different nonprofits. So happy to dive in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. And for those that don't know, what could you give us kind of the 1 minute Media Cause overview? What is Media Cause and how do you all work alongside nonprofits?
Yes, we're a full service digital agency. So I have many smart and wonderful colleagues here working on things from brand to social media, of course, fundraising. We have paid media strategists, marketing technology, and data analysis. So we do quite a bit, and and they all work together. Yeah, it's an excellent place.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. Josh, what was your squiggle into working now alongside nonprofits? And most importantly, where we partner with you all is with organizing people together in community at the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference. What was that squiggle for you?
Yeah. Well, it started, I guess, in 1988. I was a first grader, perhaps, at Maple Lane Elementary in Claymont, Delaware. And we had a Toys for Tots or Meals on Wheels. I always forget which one it was. A Meals on Wheels fundraising drive at school. And for every silver coin that you brought in, you got a little tag to put on your backpack. And I walked my neighborhood collecting silver coins from my neighbors so I could have the most tags on my backpack. I've been fundraising ever since. First, after sort of that experience as a young kid, I got involved in political fundraising. I was a political fundraiser for quite a while. I moved over to the nonprofit side of things when the political person I was working for passed away, and I helped his family start a foundation in his honor. And I never went back to political fundraising because I think that the ability nonprofits have to make a difference in the world is growing and is maybe even eclipsing that of our political leaders to make true change. And there's just different things. I don't want to get political here, but there's just different things that nonprofits can solve, different problems that nonprofits can solve. And I love being a part of that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for being here, Josh and Dan, and giving of your time and experience. Let's get into it. So we've left 2023 behind and are kicking off 2024. We're 10 days in. It feels like sometimes I've already been in 2024 for months, but we're only 10 days into 2024. What would you advise nonprofits leave behind in 2023? What should they learn from 2023? And what should they double down on as they go into 2024? Josh?
So for me, the thing that you should leave behind absolutely is tracking metrics that don't matter or that don't mean anything. And the thing I'm on a bandwagon or on a soapbox today about is open rates. I don't think open rates are even remotely what they used to be. It's become so easy for folks to get hooked on open rates and track them as the thing that matters. Our donors are engaged, our supporters are engaged because they're opening our emails. There's ways that the email clients you're using are being tricked by Apple and by other platforms. You can mark everything as red, and that counts as an open, perhaps. So I encourage folks to leave behind open rates, start tracking more metrics that matter. What are some of those metrics that matter? What do I think you should lean into? Click-through rates. That's my big thing. Tracking click-through rates. You want me to keep going, or do you want Dan to do what to leave behind?
Josh. Yeah, what else should they bring with them, or what should they double down on in 2024 at a high level? We're going to get into the weeds on planning and stuff, but just at a high level, what would you recommend they hold tightly on and double down on?
I think the generosity of your major donors is something to hold on tight to. I know a bunch of folks in the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference community, fundraisers I talk to on a weekly basis, were sort of bailed out by their major donors. And so double down on telling wonderfully powerful stories to your major donors moving forward.
Thanks for that, Josh. Dan?
Yeah, I'd add to that. I'd say as it relates to majors, mids and majors, one category for any of my clients and anyone that I would work with, I'd want to talk to them about donor advised funds in the context of their digital marketing. But broadly speaking, just thinking about where that's going. I suppose if I were to ditch something, and this might be premature, but I would say crypto. I would say thinking about, like, there's just too much volatility to even think about carving out the time that it would take on the nonprofit staff to really make headway into pursuing those, in my view. It would just much more better served pursuing traditional gifts, and then of course other traditional giving mechanisms besides straight cash.
Absolutely.
Yeah, take all those resources you were putting in crypto fundraising and swap them out to donor advised funds. That's one of my top 3 things nonprofits should be thinking about is donor advised funds this year.
Yeah. Well, since we brought up the topic of donor advised funds, let's just go ahead and dive into it. So someone said in the chat, I think it's Kaylee, she said, would love to hear more about digital marketing and DAF. So Dan, I'm going to come back to you on this because you use these two things together. And I think maybe sometimes we look at DAFs as a untapped resource we should be having conversations with our donors about. But how does that relate to digital fundraising, or how do you activate DAF giving via digital fundraising? Could you speak more to that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's like both. It's like covertly and overtly. So, for example, an overt way I might think about donor advised funds would be on a donation form. And I would still hold my principles about digital marketing and digital fundraising, where I'd want to test the placement or the inclusion of such like a widget or explanation or something extra on your donation form. That would be a covert way. I'm sorry, an overt way to sort of to get at that decision making. And then on the less obvious ways, but I'd start to I'd want nonprofits to think critically about their segmentation and their marketing automation in this regard. So that said, as far as donor advised funds, um, whenever we talk about these, I'm always inclined to also add like the best path to a donor advised fund is still a cash gift. Meaning like, so like if you're aiming to pursue donor advised funds, great. Like that means that you're pursuing cash gifts as well, and doing so at a strong clip. So yeah, a few different ways, but I think generally I'd want to see nonprofits just having that permeate the donor advised fund option permeate more exclusively throughout the donor journey.
And by that, just from a practical standpoint, is that just making your donors aware that giving via donor advised fund is encouraged to the organization? So that's saying, hey, you could give directly, or you can use your donor advised fund. Is it embedding it more into your channel communication? Is there any other kind of maybe practical examples of where you've seen that drive success for a client?
I would say, and Joshua, curious to hear what you think here, but my thought here is that because we've seen such popularity, a rise in popularity in donor advised funds, donors know about them.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's becoming a choice. And so, meaning a choice between nonprofits that make it readily and easily available to do exactly that, or whether or not they accept these kinds of gifts. So, like, I think it's more about setting up the mechanisms that make it easy for a donor to choose your nonprofit in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say I would advise folks to do three things if you're running down donor advised funds. First, find a piece of technology that integrates with whatever donation platform you're using that allows donors to check a box and either right then get access to their donor advised fund or download some paperwork that they can send off to get that check, to make that to make it as frictionless as possible. I'm not sure of all the platforms out there. I'm sure if you just Google that, you'd find a couple. Then the second thing I would do is I'd tell folks to go out and find their community foundation and get on the radar of their community foundation, where a lot of these donor advised funds are housed. There's also much bigger organizations like Fidelity and others that have donor advised funds, but you'd be surprised at the number of community foundation fundraisers or donor relations people whose job is to answer the phone when a donor calls and says, hey, I really want to help hungry kids. And that person's job is to tell them the organizations in their community who are feeding hungry kids. So find out who those people are at your local community foundation and talk to them. And the third thing I would do is incorporate donor advised funds and in your conversations with your major and especially with your mid donors. I think that's one of the things that everybody should be doubling down on this year is their mid-level donors, especially, and lifting them up to major donors. So if you have somebody who's doing $500 or $600 a year and they have a donor advised fund, that's untapped money. So they could still be giving you $500 or $600 from their general operating charitable fund, i.e. their checking account, but they also be able to make a more significant gift from their donor advised fund. So DAFs are a great way to lift those mids up to majors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I like about this conversation so far about DAFs is it's not thinking that you're competing with DAFs, but you're actually trying to say, hey, we want to access funds that are given through DAFs, even if that's the preferred vehicle. And we need to encourage donors to be thinking about us when they think about, oh, well, I have this DAF account, I'm going to give to it. They may have given to the DAF for convenience, and now you need to activate the DAF money in the same way you activate checking account money or general operating budget as well. It's still going after a cash gift. It's just being sourced from different places, and having that conversation directly with your supporters is great. We jumped ahead a little bit into like practical, tactical things for 2024, which I think is great. But I think a big part of planning what we should do in 2024 is actually how we look back on what worked and didn't work in 2023. As you would, what type, or I guess, as leaders are looking back and reflecting on 2023, what are some best practices or questions they should be asking to make sure that, as Josh, you said, don't pull things forward into 2024 just because, or because they've always done that? What are the questions they should be asking as they reflect on their marketing in 2023?
What is it that actually worked, right? And leave your ego behind. So I think a lot of times we look back at what worked, and we're sort of our opinions are colored by the amount of time and energy we spend into making that thing, right? So if you spent hours and hours and hours creating a Giving Tuesday campaign and it did okay, you're probably going to think it did a little bit better because of all the time that you put into it. And that's even expanded. It's even more problematic the further back in 2023 that you go. So don't worry, take out how much time and energy you put into something and focus that on the metrics that hopefully you defined in 2023 mattered to you. And so I always say, like, the best time to start reflecting is right now. So decide today on January 10th at 2:19 on the East Coast what it is you're going to be looking at this time next year, and to make sure you're tracking that stuff along the way.
Yeah, how I've heard this described is you don't two ways. One is you shouldn't have a sunk cost bias, which I think is what you said, like the amount of money and effort we pour into something, we look at it differently.
Yeah.
The other one I heard recently, which I've actually prescribed and used on my own team as we look back, is being a dispassionate analyst. Is like when you go into this is like, I need to be less passionate about what happened and more a analyst of what the results were.
Sure.
Because once we find what worked, I can then say, okay, well, how did we get those results? But sometimes we start with what did we do versus what were the results? And so dispassionate analyst is a term I've heard work really well. Josh, did you want to add?
I just to echo, that's so hard to do, especially as a frontline fundraiser or nonprofit leader. That's really hard to do. So just want to respect that fact for all of you, that it is hard, something to shoot for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think the one thing you pointed out was Giving Tuesday, and I think that's a fair call out because it was a recent campaign that a lot of organizations do. We experiment with that. It works well for some. It doesn't necessarily work well for others. I think other ones I would point to are any type of big events you're doing, looking at organic social efforts on channels that maybe you were experimenting with. Those are types of areas where you've probably invested a lot of time and energy and effort and hope, and they may not actually be performing in the way. And it's going to be different for different organizations. Dan, when you guys meet with a new client and you're saying, hey, let's look at what's working, what's not working, is there questions or maybe a framework you all use to help organizations reflect on where you should double down on?
Well, I think we kind of started this conversation around acquisition and retention. One of the ways MediaCause and us, the way I like to think about these two categories is both in the single category around donor lifetime value. So like that's kind of where I like to sort of center my clients around when we think about almost anything from lead generation to donor acquisition to donor retention. Like the whole construct of it should ladder up to that LTV goal. And so when we start from that sort of place where we are aligned on a singular objective, which is to drive overall value among each and every donor, then I think that helps to clarify subsequent choices down the line, or maybe more accurately, put like up the funnel. When we think about sort of the fundraiser looking at the marketing funnel, I would assume the way I look at it is from the bottom up. Right. So like if you're thinking about LTV at the bottom and looking up to the rest of your choices, your marketing choices, I think that's a helpful frame for us because it really centers both acquisition and retention. And I would just add too, like around, and Joshua would be curious on your take around storytelling on this, because it really then, and I talk about this a lot, like I can appreciate the short-term revenue goals that every single nonprofit has. That said, the best way to affect them is to pursue long-term revenue goals amongst those donors. And so with that in mind, like I think that LTV, the broader LTV goal can really help to clarify choices that are happening in between like your key fundraising moments, most notably around like storytelling, how you might go about it, who might be telling it, all the different choices that go into that part of the relationship building for a donor. I think it can just help clarify. Like I say, it can help clarify the choice and the decision making up the funnel.
So when an organization has visibility into kind of, okay, here's what our current lifetime values are for various donor segments, the question I think is really hard, even once you've gone through that step and you start viewing things through that, is, okay, well, where do I apply effort and energy? Like, is it in cultivating more major donors because there's, higher growth opportunity there? Is it that we have a very solid retention and cultivation strategy, and now's the time to double down on bringing more donors into the fold or more supporters into the fold? What are ways organizations maybe can vet where they should think about prioritizing? And is there almost a order of operations that they need to, almost like if you take your car in, it's like, hey, we got to check to see if like the tires work or the engine works first, then the tires, then this. Is there kind of a recommended order of operations before they start applying investments for 2024 that you would encourage them to go through? And Josh or Dan, you can jump in on this.
You want to take the lead on this one, Dan?
I'll go ahead. Yeah. Sure. And I'll just say my own bias, the wheels are the most important part of the car. Because without the wheels, the engine, it doesn't matter. But so I guess as far as, how to prioritize, one of the ways that we recently looked at this for a client was looking at their mid-level. So for them, it was a top 4-figure and up to their high 4 figures. And we noticed that within what we found was, in a way, for a healthy way for us, I think, to probably prioritize, because this is my long answer around to say it's going to be a mixed bag on how you might prioritize different donor groups. But the way we sort of understood how we might go about prioritizing them is both looking at the number of people in any given donor group and then their subsequent value. So for what happened with this particular client, what we saw was that at their mid-level program, they have the vast majority of their all mid-level people at the lowest tier, and they represented like 80% of the population and like 90% of the volume of the revenue volume, and then 90% of like the lifetime value, even though you of course had fewer donors giving it much higher clips and still represented a great amount of potential lifetime value. But as they existed today, the current in the door value was much greater for the lower level, mid-level group. The other side of that, what we also learned for this particular nonprofit, was that most people who joined that mid-level group did so not directly with a mid-level gift, but over time with a handful of 2- and 3-figure gifts. And so all that got us into thinking was like, it made us say, okay, it's clear to us that this first tier of our mid-level is like the most valuable of all of our mid-levels. It's clear that a lot of our mid-levels are becoming mid-levels because they've made smaller incremental gifts prior. That means that if we're to drive mid-level revenue gains, we need to think about driving lower level gifts among more people. So that's clarified for us how we think about, in this instance, donor acquisition, but also retention, but mostly donor acquisition in terms of like how we want to start someone into the mid-level tier. It's not going to be with $1,000 gift. It's likely to be with a $200 or less gift. And it's likely to take 2.5 years to get to where we want them to be. So it's just like one way. It's going to be a mixed bag on how, depending on the nonprofit, how their file might look.
Yeah. I think what I appreciate about that approach is it aligns with something we talk a lot about here on Feather Live, but also in the Good Marketing Framework, is that by looking at your current best supporters, you can actually reverse engineer back the path at which you acquired those current best donors, and potentially even look at them from a persona or profile standpoint. A lot of times we look at like, how do we keep retaining these other donors, or how do we get more bigger donors, or how do I acquire more donors, without really understanding who your current best donors are and how they became that. And then investing effort into getting more people that look like our best donors, or at least mirror some of the profiles or propensities. And then also encouraging them to take a similar path by putting invested effort. And that reverse engineering is exactly what you're talking about, Dan. Josh, anything to add here on kind of the checklist you would have someone go through to make sure that they're investing in the right order?
Yeah. I would just I want to point out that Dan's the understanding that Dan found for that client, where their most engaged mid-level donors are actually making a bunch of lower dollar gifts over the course of a year or a couple of years. So important. I can't tell you how many nonprofits I work with who get a random $5,000 check from a donor, and they say, "Oh, this donor isn't a $5,000 donor; they're a $250 donor." But when they go back and look, they've made 4 $250 gifts over the last 6 months or 8 months. So they actually are in that category of major or mid-level donors. So the more you know your donors and the more you're looking at each individual gift they make, the more likely you are to have a full picture of who they are. And so maybe back to your initial point, the key for me, and I agree with Dan, like the wheels are the most important part. And so for me, and I'm not a great sort of car analogy person, so I might lose this, but for me, the wheels are just your donor communications, creating these repeatable assets that you can use time and time again. And so it's the appeal, it's the fundraising offer you have. What is it you're asking your donors to do? What's the problem you're asking them to solve? If you figure out a couple of those for your organization, you can scale that for small dollar donors to mid-level donors to major donors. Feed one person might be the offer you have for in your direct mail or your fundraising emails. That becomes, feed a family for a month, or feed, a school classroom worth of children. And then for major donors, it's help us build a new kitchen where we can feed even more people. So like finding a couple of those offers, I think would be the thing that I would focus on, knowing that you can then scale them up to wherever, the need, wherever that sweet spot is for your most active donors.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk specifically about different channels that organizations use, and if there are any observations that you've seen with your clients or even predict us to see with clients in 2024 across a variety of maybe digital marketing channels and even kind of maybe buzzwords. And so we're kind of doing a lightning round in the middle of this that was unplanned. So I'll prep everyone that this was unplanned. But I do want to kind of get into the weeds on asking like specific questions. And so Dan and Josh, I would love to know if your opinion on email marketing for nonprofits in 2024. Is there things that organizations should be doing or making sure that they're using email for? Should they be investing more in email or less in email? What's your kind of hot take on email marketing for nonprofits? And then we'll go through a few more channels as we go through. I'm going to jump to Dan. Dan, what's your take on email marketing?
Well, I'd say if I were to predict, I'd say more email volume in 2024. I'd say that because one, the calendar days of the week, specifically 12/30, 12/31, are not weekends this year. So like I expect nonprofits to make hay in that respect, but by doing so with more email volume. The other key point about 2024, and there's obviously an election in 2024, and so one of the things, at least for email marketing, but I'd encourage nonprofits to think back to 2020 in terms of how the fundraising felt and how the emailing felt, likely needing to keep up with or compete within the louder noise that's going to be happening. And then, on the email front too, I think nonprofits probably need to level up their sort of the way they're tailoring their messaging, particularly now in the context of what we just talked about around acquisition and retention, but also in the context of what is happening in the world in the donor's life in 2024, and then really making sure you meet them when and where they are. And that's why I'm pulling that out for email, because that is like the most personal sort of digital channel that we can have. So for that regard, that's kind of, I think that's where my head's at, certainly for email.
Yeah. So just to summarize, like more volume, maybe more similar to kind of pacing and strategy of 2020, given especially with elections, not only just here in the US, but there's global things going on as well all over in 2024. It's a very busy year and distracting year, let alone like conflicts and natural disasters, which also always happen in any given calendar year. So more volume, more pacing, I really appreciate you kind of pointing out, like, how do we use email in a more intimate capacity? Because it is like one of the most intimate digital channels. And often I feel like we've forgotten that, in the same way we probably forget that with direct mail. Often it's like it's being consumed one-to-one, even if you're sending it 1 to a million or 1 to 1,000, like it's still being consumed, if it is being consumed, 1-to-1. And so how do we make sure that the messaging and content and even timing of those is not just personalized, but it's taking that intimacy into consideration? That's a great point.
Yeah.
Josh?
100% everything you and Dan both said. I would say 3 things to get your emails. So definitely more email. 3 things I think you should do to get your emails open more. Number 1, make sure it's coming from a person. So it should come from Josh at nonprofit. Make sure that account is monitored, right? It could actually even be your own, however that works, depending on your list size, but make sure it's monitored. You'd be surprised, no, to your point, how many people still think that email is actually one-to-one and will respond. So have it come from an actual email address, which will help with deliverability rather than info at or whatever it may be. So make sure that you're sending it from a person. Number 2, tell stories that your supporters want to read. So there's going to be a lot of email, to Dan's point with the election. There's going to be a lot of emails asking for money. There's going to be a lot of emails with all bold letters and flashing GIFs and all this stuff. Like, don't do that, right? Be the thing in a person's inbox that's not like everything else, and stand out by telling powerful stories, by not just asking, but by telling the donor the importance of their gift and what their gift did. Use email to share really great stories of success regularly, so that when your donors then see and ask, they're like, oh, okay, well, I know this organization does a bunch of really good work delivering arts to our community. Okay, great. Well, now that they have a problem, and the show that the 8th graders are putting on isn't going to go on because they don't have any costumes, I'll make a gift to make that happen. So tell really good stories and don't look like all the other nonsense out there. And then the third thing I would say is this is super tactical and super silly, but if you want to get your emails noticed and opened, you have to have good subject lines. And so I would figure out how to get some emojis in there. I think that's going to be, a lot of email clients are now starting to be able to make that possible. So on the nonprofit level, the commercial folks have been able to do it for a long time, but try and stand out in your inbox with good subject lines as well as some emojis.
Yeah, all great advice, Josh. Anytime we talk about email, the question of volume comes up. You both just prescribed more volume, but didn't prescribe whether that's 5 milliliters or 10 milliliters, but in this case, like 1 per week. I think the question of volume always comes up, and Melissa brought this up, is like there's an internal debate on how many emails we should send.
Yeah.
How do you, I don't want you to answer her question directly on like what's the amount we should send, because I think that's like a dead end road. That's not the point. But how would you help someone like Melissa, and I'm sure there are 10, 20, 30, 40 more Melissas on this call, navigate this conversation internally about volume? Dan?
I'll jump into, I guess I start with the M&R benchmarks. I look at them every year, and any other benchmark that you can look at. There's a lot of reputable studies that are out there. I have it pulled up in front of me, Melissa. I was trying to, and no, I'm glad you pointed Melissa's question out. I was about to rattle off the answer, but it really is, I'm looking at the benchmark. It really is a number that fluctuates depending on the nonprofit vertical you're in. So let's pull that, for example, low in the number annually at 53 last year was number of emails per subscriber per year that a cultural institution sent to their list. So cultural institution, Smithsonian, where I used to work, or like the Met, or anyone that works at maybe a local children's museum, that probably puts you in a category of fewer relative emails to, say, international relief. And they led the verticals with nearly twice that number. So like the international relief space is sending twice the number of emails than the cultural space. And there's probably a right size for each individual vertical that you sit within, and then broadly speaking, compete with your peers in. So depending on the vertical that you are in, and I encourage you to look at benchmarks to see where that is, to try and give yourselves a picture of what that could look like. But it could look like anywhere for like an international relief, that number comes out to 2 per week. And then at the lower end, it's closer to 1 per week.
Josh, anything to add on that?
Yeah, definitely check the benchmarks. That's where I would suggest folks start. And then I would put yourself in the brain or in the shoes of your team, and what are their pushbacks? Why are they pushing back on this? I suspect that they're pushing back because the content that you're wanting to send is not super relevant. And so I'd rather an organization send fewer emails, but have all of that be content that's relevant to the donors or to the segment of your donors. Obviously, we're encouraging folks to segment to the best of their ability. And so worry less about the volume and more about the quality and the content. So if you have a bunch of really great stuff, send it out frequently. But put yourself in the shoes or in the mind of the people who are sort of disagreeing with you or challenging your more is better kind of approach. So that's maybe the first thing. The second thing I would say is, well, just to that, the disaster international relief, right? There are tons of needs. They're constantly dealing with crises, and there's always a need for their for gifts. And so they're emailing more frequently because there's more needs. So the other thing I would say is anytime there's an acute need that your organization serves, that your beneficiaries are experiencing or your community is experiencing, don't worry when the last time you emailed was. Ask your donors to help if there's an urgent need in your community. Those would be my two thoughts.
We talked about email marketing, which I feel like is, foundational digital channel in the same way direct mail is still a powerful channel. Sticking with digital channels, what about digital advertising? Different channel, critical to successful. All the benchmark reports say nonprofits are investing more in digital advertising. What should that look like, or how do you imagine that's going to look for nonprofits, and any guidance for them in 2024? Dan?
Yeah, so like over the years, things have shifted a little bit, but I think for the most part, some things remain true. One, like my default advice to nonprofits is like, are you spending fully your Google ad grant to drive high quality site traffic? Yes, great. Let's also add paid search, Google search into the mix in an evergreen clip to drive donations all year round, and then be strategic about monthly giving and then other times of year. And then next channel up, I would think about also search, but Bing. Most nonprofits are not going to get I'm not going to be able to spend a lot in Bing, but they'll likely be able to drive large gifts, but just fewer large gifts. For whatever reason, I've seen Bing, just like I said, just drive larger gifts, but you're not able to spend as much compared to Google search. And then so I suppose Meta is the one that's been the most dynamic ad platform over the years. Prior to their privacy changes, Meta was a pretty strong driver of ROAS, a pretty high performer. Things have changed a little bit, and so in that respect, I feel that really where Meta is sort of, I think, emerging like other sort of programmatic display paid channels is in this funnel of, really it's a funnel of, it's a section of storytelling in the mid funnel. So if you imagine you're serving up tactical awareness ads, but you're actually, by that by tactical awareness ads, I don't mean to say we're driving awareness for the first time of your mission to someone who's never heard of you. I'm talking about retargeting your website visitors who are likely on your email list and maybe even receive direct mail and SMS text messages from you, getting retargeted in these mid-funnel channels like YouTube, for example, but certainly on Meta, with really high quality storytelling, because that, I think that extra touch point where it's a mid-funnel non-donation ask touch point is becoming like this critical touch point when we think about the other, lifting the performance in the other channels. So for me, that's with budget allowing, it goes Google search, Bing search, Meta, and then another channel or two to think about driving that donor acquisition and really shoring up that mid funnel as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's something we see with our clients here at Feather, who use Feather to deploy their digital advertising, is that it improves the results of other channels when done well as well. And instead of just being a direct response channel, it can be a direct response channel in that way, but it actually complements email. It complements the other more intimate channels but it keeps you in front of your audience and connected with them in a relevant way more often, not just when they're in their inbox, when they're scrolling social or wandering the web or, binging on YouTube videos, like so many people actually do. Josh, any guidance on digital advertising or as people plan for 24?
Sure. I mean, definitely more Dan's wheelhouse than mine and yours, obviously, Noah. So I'll just echo everything you guys said. The more consistently your most engaged supporters are hearing from you, and that they're hearing from you stories other than there's a problem that we need you to solve, right? So I call these reporting stories, the stories of success, where you're sharing the impact of a donor's gift or the impact that your organization makes in the lives of your community beneficiaries. That's the sweet spot. And any dollar spent there will raise a lot more sort of on the back end through your other sort of more direct ask channels.
So the last channel I want to do, just to be conservative of time, because we do have a few more questions. And again, if you have questions for our panelists, feel free to drop it in the chats. But I want to talk about automation and AI. And so we can talk about them separately, but I just want your take. These are terms that I think are shared often, especially AI in the last 12 months. But automation is this thing that we talk a lot about when it relates to marketing. Where should organizations be thinking about AI and automation as it relates to 2024? Dan, do you want to take this first?
Sure. I guess, so AI, yes, it's been a very exciting year in that regard. I talked about this yesterday not even in the same context, but I think it's relevant in this, is that like all of us as nonprofit professionals, all of us as like professional people who are working should embrace AI as a way to just level up themselves at whatever you do in your job. Like you can think about AI as a way to make yourself better at it in the same way we would think of a phone or a computer that does the same thing. So just my plug be like pro AI and embrace this tech, generally speaking. I think getting to a place where AI can start to inform a lot of different choices is going to be a really exciting development in the nonprofit world, right? So like, I think you can start to think about how you might use it, for example, using artificial intelligence to help do some data mining to really help understand your best prospects or donors, right? To really understand donor behavior or constituent behavior in a way that can be predicting philanthropic behavior. That's going to be a really exciting tool when nonprofits can start to use it. I think from where I'm sitting now, I feel like the nonprofit sector itself is probably still in this about to scale place and not quite there yet where they can fully embrace AI to drive serious revenue gains. I think likely in the short term, I'm embracing AI to sort of make efficiency gains in like how they execute their business, whether that be digital marketing or grant writing or securing larger gifts like that. So I think in that respect, we're in this, I think, exciting period with lots of upshot in the next few years.
Yeah. I'm with you, Dan. I think everybody should be focused on it. It's definitely, along with donor advised funds and sort of legacy gifts and the incredible transfer of wealth that's happening in this country over the next few years. I think AI is right there as one of the things that nonprofit leaders have to be on top of. I'm also with you that like we're not quite there yet where it can really help us in a lot of our fundraising efforts. It can certainly help in a variety of smaller ways right now. So if I'm a fundraiser out there looking to figure out how to use AI, I'm telling people to use it to create good subject lines for your emails. Don't use it to write your fundraising appeals. Don't use it to write your fundraising asks because it's not there yet. It will kick back a bunch of malarkey that's not going to help you. Actually, probably do worse. But use it to make any of your donor communications sound more human. Drop it in ChatGPT and say, make this sound human, right? So it's not full of jargon and all that stuff that we as fundraisers, nonprofit fundraisers, have a tendency to rely on. I'd also suggest using it when you're writing a grant, like take this and make it 50 words, right? So you can use it to trim down, ChatGPT especially. I'm also a big fan of using it, using the AI generated art to get like a good picture. Again, not of humans, just a drawing or something. Do a pen and ink drawing of whatever and use that on an event invitation, on a flyer, or as a graphic for social media. love using ChatGPT to take a sort of fundraising offer or any kind of donor communication and turning it into a variety of social media posts. But again, with all this stuff, like make sure you're reading it. I can't tell you how many times over the last 2 months I've gotten a marketing email from someone, and I'm like, that was written by ChatGPT. So you don't want it to sound like it was written by ChatGPT. And I see a lot of what ChatGPT writes, so I'm maybe more familiar with it. But I just got one the other day from a guy who sells custom Lego sets that my kid loves. I'm like, he wrote this from ChatGPT. It doesn't sound like any other email I've gotten from him over the last 2 years. So those are my couple thoughts on AI. But you got to be thinking about it, folks. And it's easier to tackle than you might think.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think the simplest way is to look at it as like a sidekick, or like something that can support, but it can't do it on its own. Maybe it's like a secret weapon or like a tool belt or something, but it's just like the other things in your tool bag. And I think we should continue to seek out AI to help drive operational efficiency and, like you said, streamline some of the collaboration efforts, but not really do it just for you. It's not replacing things in that way. I think automation falls into that same category, and it's been around a lot longer, as there's a lot of dialogue on like, well, we don't want to automate the human touch and the human connection. But no, automation is a tool to leverage to help you do the things you want to do when you should do them. In the same way we have task management software and stuff to manage our to-do list, like automation's helping us retain a more positive and healthy relationship with more people, and kind of expand that major gift officer experience to more and more people, both externally and then internally, and surface the right people to talk to at the right time. Both key things. There's a few other channels that people brought up. They mentioned TikTok and podcast. Instead of addressing those ones specifically, unless you have comments, alternative channels. The core foundational channels are direct mail, phone, email, search, digital advertising. You mentioned even YouTube and other things, but like those are kind of the bread and butter. But there are other channels like like someone mentioned, TikTok is even doing that. There's some like other interesting ad networks popping up, podcasting, other channels. Any alternative channels that are exciting to you that nonprofits should be paying closer attention to? Josh?
I mean, I'll defer sort of to Dan on this. I'd love to hear what he thinks. Where my brain is right now is how we can use text messaging to engage more with our major donors. And there's a couple platforms out there that can help personalize and humanize, sort of make it feel less automated, or use automated text messaging for one particular reason, i.e. like book a meeting or, confirm a Zoom or a coffee, something like that. But our major donors are not checking their email in the way that we expect them to be. They're probably still checking their mail. So I would encourage, direct mail as a primary channel for major gifts. If you're not in an organization that has, a bunch of major gift officers, but how text messaging can be used to sort of deepen those relationships and just sort of ratchet it up and speed things up. That would be where I'd go, but I'd love to hear what Dan has to say.
Yeah.
I think, yes to SMS. Like, one of the things on, what I was reflecting on end of year is, just the number of nonprofits that I received really quality text messages on like the 30th and 31st. And I thought those did really well, considering that both those days were the weekend. I'm also thinking about myself as a older millennial who SMS is my preferred channel. Don't call me ever. Text me all the time. Right. And I think we can all identify with that. So SMS is a channel for an emerging, that Gen X to older millennial emerging donor demographic. I think is something to think about. We've had I saw the question come across around TikTok. So I've seen clients, particularly a local client, so someone with a brick and mortar with a small local footprint, and a founder that's like a superstar, someone who's great on screen, will lend themselves to the channels that are built for that really dynamic person on screen, maybe like one or a person on the street interview, 2-person on screen. If you have the people, if you have this really charismatic leader that is really good on camera, like you might do well in some of those formats like TikTok, as far as pursuing the goals that you're thinking about. So I like TikTok for groups that are, like I say, brick and mortar and have a local footprint with a sort of that all-star, superstar, great on camera type leader or face. I've seen that work well.
Yeah, I'm glad we called out SMS. I know SMS is a growing importance for us as a platform. We're actually rolling out SMS inside of Feather alongside search, email, and digital and social advertising because it's growing in connection. And Feather's platform is trying to design itself to help you connect with your supporters wherever they are. So definitely highlight that. Josh, you highlighted another great tool, Rally Corp. Love the founder over there as well. If you're looking for something immediately and more lightweight, I think that's a great option. But yeah, SMS is really important. I think it was a great call out, Dan, on something like TikTok, but I think it'd be applied to other channels. And I mentioned this in the chat, was it really depends on who your audience is and making sure you're not just pursuing a channel because, and making sure it really aligns with the who. And going back to Dan, your point is, who are your current best donors or the maybe rising star donors, and how do we best connect with them across an omni-channel experience? And I think that's what I would close on too, is as we look at this, and I know you all are shaking your head, so I think you would echo this, is it's not a channel specific strategy. It has to be a community strategy. Yes. And then we're leveraging content and channels to cultivate connection. And so as you're thinking about your marketing plan in 2024, I think it's important to start with the people, then talk about the channels and the content, and then talk about how you're going to drive the outcomes that you need for this year. Dan, Josh, we only have 5 minutes left of our time together. I know we could go on for more than that. But one of our core values here at Feather is to be practical. And New Year's always bring new beginnings. But I would love to get your 1 to 2 practical tips that you would want to leave leaders with as they plan for 2024. Where can they walk away with some practical items? Josh?
Sure. I'll just start by saying when I do these webinars, there's always one key nugget and insight that I write down on a sticky note, and it stands yes to SMS. That's not just a great line, but so that wins the sticky note line of the day. So a couple things,
like a political chant, like yes to SMS. You know, like I feel like we're leaning back into that. But sorry, Josh, I digress. Go ahead.
So a couple things. I mean, the most practical, the easiest, the most easily implemented tactic that I have for folks would be to use direct mail to drive your major donor relationships. The fact of the matter is, if you're at an organization and you have just a couple of fundraisers, a couple of folks in your fundraising team, you probably have more major donors than you can manage. You could probably only manage a handful at a time unless you're doing it full time. And so I would encourage you to pick 5 or 6 major donors that you can be in relationship with, depending on how much time you have, and then use direct mail to drive the rest. That means sending them your fundraising letters and your newsletters and all that stuff in a package that's a little bit bigger. So a 9x12 envelope with a sticky note or a postcard or something sort of paper clipped together in that package. So it feels a little different. It's obviously a bigger size, making it feel more personal with hand addressed and hand stamped and that sort of stuff. Your major donors will notice that. If we're trying to get in touch and in front of our major donors, customizing, making that package feel more hand touched is the way to go. The second thing I would say is you can use, getting back to this email conversation we had, you can test all of your fundraising offers with email basically for free, right? So if you're not sure if people want to feed a family or provide backpacks for kids who are going into foster care, you can use email to test which one of those is going to generate more donations, and then use that same fundraising offer in your direct mail next year or later this year. So those would be the 2 things I would say. Lean into your major donors and using direct mail to drive those relationships, and use email to test your fundraising offers.
Dan?
This is, I suppose, a bit of a tangent because we haven't talked about it yet. But one of the things that I know I'll be talking about with clients in 2024, and I'm coming across new projects that I'm seeing, and it's the same thing. I think to affect both acquisition and retention and donor lifetime value, one of the likeliest lowest hanging fruits a nonprofit has right now is being excellent, transparent stewards of donations. By that I mean like really going the extra effort on like making sure that all of your financials are very plainly seen, that you are routinely talking about and touting your third-party ratings. Like if you have a 4-star rating on Charity Navigator, great. Tell me about that. I think there's in other areas where you can tout the seriousness with which you take the care that you take of donations, and you can talk about that and how that manifests in terms of like operating budget, but just really just about impact. Really, like I say this because I think nonprofits the nonprofit sector is, I think, unfairly being lumped into other societal institutions that are not trusted. And I think in order to make gains in lifetime value and like to sort of change the tide on donor acquisition, perhaps, is like really bringing the stewardship and the transparency to another level in 2024. So like people really, really feel great about why they're making a gift and who you are and what's going to happen once that gift is made.
That's great, Dan.
Yeah, I think especially as you said, as trust is kind of being maybe questioned in a lot of other sectors, how do we at the minimum not fall into the macro narrative of institutional distrust and remind people why they should trust you, not nonprofits as a whole, but you, and really owning that and being proud of it too, that like, hey, we're an organization that's doing something important. That's why we're reaching out to you and you're a part of that. And here's why you should trust us. I always use the 3C framework, which is every touch point should reinforce care for the cause, build confidence that you're the right organization to work on that cause, and connect with like-minded community, that there are others like you working together. And so if you have care for the cause, confidence, and community, that's every touch point should do some version of that, whether it's an appeal or whether it's an update. So that's my practical tip, is that we just have to remember what we're trying to do. We're not trying to convince or convert or even acquire, some of this like war tactic language where we're out there in the fight. And I think even especially in the political year where a lot of language is like fight, battle, war, we're trying to like cultivate connections, activate actions to make our portion of the world, whether you're a member org or a cause-based org, you're doing something important. And if you're not, you should go work at some other organization. Yeah. But if you are, there's a reason to cultivate those connections, and just keeping that top of mind is like, that's why we're reaching out. That's why we're sending more emails. That's why we're trying to tell compelling stories, etc. So that's my practical tip. Dan, Josh, thank you so much for being here. Really grateful for the time and the conversation. Thank you all for being here. This topic was, how do you create a durable growth or marketing plan? And by you being here and taking attention to say, how do I do that well, is already one step towards the outcome, because you're trying to learn from others and you're trying to plan well. So thank you all for being here. Grateful that you're here. And we'll be sending follow-up emails with summaries from this conversation and an on-demand option that you might want to share with your team. And as always, we're back here almost every week on Feather Live, typically on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And so look out for those invites in your inbox. And as always, if Feather can be a partner in your growth for 2024, feel free to reach out to us. Dan, Josh, thank you again. Grateful for you. And hopefully everyone has a great start to their 2024. Until next time, see ya.
See you guys.
Bye.